If you've ever looked at something from the past and felt a quiet sense of unease, like it didn't belong where it was, this video is for you. Because somewhere deep down, you already know something isn't adding up. We're told our ancestors were primitive, that they struggled, improvised, and slowly figured things out. That progress moves in a straight line from simple to advanced, from crude to refined. But what if that story isn't true? What if there were moments in the past where humans reached levels of skill and understanding that we still can't fully explain today? Not myths, not legends, real places, real stone, real evidence. And once you see it, it becomes very hard to unsee. In this series, we're going to examine 14 locations around the world that challenge the official timeline of human history, not by speculation, but by physics, by engineering, by material science, by asking one simple question that history often avoids. How was this actually built? Tonight, we begin with a place that looks ordinary from the outside, a place that hides one of the most uncomfortable questions in archaeology. High in the rocky hills of eastern India, there are caves that should not exist. From a distance, the Barabar Hills look unremarkable. Jagged granite outcrops, dry earth, heat-soaked stone that has been weathered for millions of years. If you were hiking through this region, you'd probably assume these hills were entirely natural. But hidden inside the solid granite are chambers that feel like a mistake in time. When you step inside one of these caves, something immediately feels wrong. The outside world is rough, uneven, chaotic. The inside is not. The walls are perfectly smooth, not just smooth, mirror smooth, polished to such a degree that light reflects off the stone as if it were glass. The surfaces are flat, symmetrical, and precise in a way that feels deliberate, controlled, modern. And this isn't soft stone. This is granite. Granite ranks near the top of the hardness scale. It's harder than iron, harder than bronze, hard enough that even modern construction treats it with caution. Yet here, over 2,000 years ago, someone hollowed entire chambers directly into solid granite and polished the interior to perfection. No tool marks, no chisel scars, no visible errors, just flawless stone. Officially, these caves are dated to the 3rd century BC. We're told they were created during the Mauryan Empire under Emperor Ashoka and gifted to a religious sect known as the Ajavikas. That explanation sounds neat, clean, settled. But the stone tells a different story. Granite doesn't forgive mistakes. It doesn't respond well to improvisation. It fractures, it chips, it resists. To carve granite with iron chisels, the best tools available at the time, is already difficult. To polish it to a mirror finish on curved surfaces is something else entirely. Even today, achieving that level of polish requires mechanized grinding, controlled pressure, and abrasive systems designed to remove material evenly at high speed. And yet, the Barabar caves were finished without leaving behind any evidence of such tools. This is where the problem begins. The standard explanation is that thousands of workers slowly chipped away at the rock, then spent months sanding the surface using abrasive sand and water. On paper, this sounds possible. In reality, engineers know it is. Hand sanding is inconsistent. It produces waves, slight dips, micro irregularities that are impossible to eliminate over large surfaces. But the walls inside these caves are flat to within fractions of a millimeter. Not in one spot. Everywhere. The geometry is so precise that modern laser measurements struggle to find deviation. That kind of uniformity suggests controlled material removal, not manual abrasion. And there's another detail that makes this even harder to explain. The polish hasn't faded. After more than 2,000 years of humidity, temperature changes, human contact, and environmental exposure, the surfaces still reflect light clearly. That tells us the finish wasn't superficial. It was deep, structural, the result of a process that fundamentally altered the surface of the stone. Then there's the acoustics. Stand in the center of one of these chambers and speak softly. Your voice doesn't disappear. It returns to you. Amplified, sustained, focused. A clap echoes for several seconds, bouncing cleanly off the curved granite walls. The sound doesn't scatter randomly. It resonates. This isn't accidental. The chambers were shaped with deliberate geometry, circular, elliptical, and vaulted forms that enhance resonance. Shapes that modern acoustic engineers still use today in concert halls and recording spaces. The stone itself contains quartz, a mineral known for its piezoelectric properties. Under pressure or vibration, quartz can generate small electrical charges. Some researchers believe the combination of polished quartz-rich granite and precise chamber geometry created environments that affected sound, vibration, and possibly even human perception. These weren't living spaces. They were designed environments. Here's where the mystery deepens. If this was the peak of Mayan engineering, we would expect to see a progression. Earlier attempts, rough prototypes, smaller versions nearby. But there are none. No practice caves. No partially polished walls showing learning curves. No gradual improvement. The work appears fully developed from the beginning. Every finished cave displays the same impossible polish, the same precision, the same control. And one cave reveals something even more unsettling. An unfinished chamber shows that the polishing was done before the carving was complete. The interior walls were already mirror smooth, while the entrance was still being cut. This suggests that polishing wasn't the final step. It was part of the carving process itself. That alone should make us stop and reconsider everything we think we know about ancient stoneworking. There's also a logistical problem no one likes to talk about. To hollow out these chambers, hundreds of tons of granite had to be removed. Where did it go? There are no massive debris piles surrounding the hills, no evidence of waste disposal on the scale this project would require. Granite doesn't vanish. It has to be moved, managed, transported. Yet the landscape is quiet, clean, silent. It's as if the stone was never removed in the first place, or was processed in a way that left no trace. The inscriptions inside the caves add another layer of discomfort. They are crude, shallow, uneven. They look like they were added later. Compared to the precision of the chambers themselves, the inscriptions feel almost amateur. This has led some researchers to ask an uncomfortable question. What if the Mayans didn't build the caves? What if they inherited them, repurposed them, claimed them? History is full of examples where later cultures occupied structures they didn't create, temples reused, monuments rebranded, ancient sites absorbed into new belief systems. If that's what happened here, then the true builders of Barabar existed before recorded Indian history. And if that's true, we have no idea who they were. What we're left with is a contradiction. On one side, we have the official timeline: iron tools, manual labor, slow progress. On the other, we have physical evidence: precision, polish, acoustics, geometry, and missing waste. Both cannot be true at the same time. Either ancient workers possessed a stoneworking method that has completely vanished from the archaeological record, or the Barabar caves belong to a much older chapter of human history that we have yet to fully uncover. And this is just the beginning. Because once you accept that one site doesn't fit the story, you start seeing the pattern everywhere. Across continents, across cultures, across thousands of years. In the next video, we're going to leave India and travel to China, where an abandoned project frozen in time reveals the exact moment when a civilization reached for a level of engineering it could no longer achieve. A single stone, weighing more than any structure humans have ever attempted to move. And a question no historian has been able to answer. Why would anyone start something so impossible? There are moments in history where ambition leaves behind fingerprints. Not success, not triumph, but hesitation. Moments where a civilization reaches for something enormous and then stops. Not because it lacked power, not because it lacked workers, but because it crossed a line it could no longer pass. In eastern China, near the ancient capital of Nanjing, there is a place where time froze at that exact moment. A quarry where stone was cut, shaped, and prepared for a monument so large that even today, we struggle to understand why anyone believed it could be moved. This isn't a legend. It isn't lost. It isn't buried. It's still there, partially carved, still attached to the mountain, abandoned in silence. This is the Yangshan Quarry, and it tells a story history rarely wants to tell. At first glance, Yangshan doesn't look like a failure. It looks intentional. 3 massive stone components remain locked into the living rock, each one shaped with care, each one measured, each one prepared for transport. These weren't rough cuts. They weren't experiments. They were finished pieces. The largest of them, the base, weighs an estimated 16,000 tons. To put that number into perspective, the heaviest stones used in the Great Pyramid of Giza weigh around 80 tons. The famous stone of the pregnant woman in Baalbek weighs about 1,000 tons. Yangshan's base alone is 16 times heavier than that. If assembled, the monument would have stood nearly 250 feet tall, taller than a modern 20-story building, carved entirely from stone. This wasn't a statue. It was a declaration. Historical records tell us this project was commissioned in the early 15th century by the Yongle Emperor, one of the most powerful rulers of the Ming dynasty. This was not a weak or struggling empire. This was the same era that produced the Forbidden City. The same era that launched massive treasure fleets across the Indian Ocean. The same era that mobilized hundreds of thousands of workers with ruthless efficiency. The Ming state knew how to build, which makes Yangshan deeply unsettling, because nothing about this project suggests hesitation at the start. Only at the end. The quarry shows extraordinary planning. Deep vertical channels were cut around each stone, some over 40 feet deep. The stone was isolated from the mountain by removing material on all sides, leaving only small stone pedestals beneath. This is precise work. Granite and limestone behave unpredictably under stress. Remove too much too quickly and the entire block fractures. Remove too little and it cannot be freed. Yet the cuts are clean, even, controlled. There is very little evidence of overcutting, very little cracking. This tells us the engineers understood internal stone stress. They weren't guessing, they were calculating. And they weren't improvising. Large protrusions, known as bosses, were intentionally left on the sides of the stones. These weren't decorative, they were anchor points. Places where ropes, levers, or lifting systems were meant to attach. In other words, this project wasn't abandoned halfway through planning. It was abandoned after planning was complete. So why stop? The official explanation is simple. The stones were too heavy to move. But that answer raises a more troubling question. Why begin at all? The Ming engineers weren't amateurs. They built canals, bridges, city walls, and palaces. They understood load limits. They understood friction. They understood gravity. They even developed methods for moving heavy stone using ice roads, pouring water over winter paths to reduce friction. Those techniques worked for stones weighing a few hundred tons. They do not work for 16,000. The pressure alone would crush ice instantly. Timber sleds would shatter. Ropes made from hemp or bamboo would snap under the strain. Even with 10,000 men pulling in unison, the force required to overcome static friction would exceed the strength of organic materials available at the time. This wasn't a surprise that emerged late. It should have been obvious from the beginning, which means the decision to start this project wasn't based on ignorance. It was based on something else. One possibility is imitation. Across the ancient world, there are older megalithic sites where enormous stones were moved and placed with apparent ease. Baalbek, Egypt, South America. By the 15th century, the knowledge behind those feats may have already been lost. The Ming engineers may have been trying to replicate something they no longer fully understood. They could cut the stone. They could shape it. But moving it, that was a different science. And that science may not have survived into their era. There's another problem that doesn't get discussed often. Waste. To isolate these stones, hundreds of thousands of tons of rock had to be removed. Where did it go? Some of it may have been reused in nearby construction, including the Ming Xiaoling Mausoleum, but not all of it. The volume is enormous. Yangshan doesn't look like a simple quarry, it looks industrial. Different teams worked simultaneously. Tool marks suggest standardized methods. This was an organized operation, not ad hoc labor. And yet, once the stones were freed, once they were ready, everything stopped. No attempt to reduce their size. No attempt to break them into manageable pieces. No attempt to reuse the material. They were simply left behind. That decision alone suggests something important. The stones were meant to be moved as they were. Anything else would defeat the purpose. Standing at the site today, there's an overwhelming sense of restraint. Not failure. Restraint. As if someone finally said, "This goes beyond us." The Ming didn't lack power. They lacked the final piece. The ability to move mass on that scale. And if they lacked it, where did it go? Because earlier civilizations appear to have had it. This leads to a deeply uncomfortable idea. That technological progress is not linear. That certain forms of knowledge can peak, disappear, and never return. We tend to think of history as a ladder, always climbing. But Yangshan suggests something else. A civilization looking backward, trying to reach something it once had, and failing. The quarry is not just unfinished stone. It's a record of a missing science. There's a reason Yangshan, is rarely emphasized in popular history. It doesn't fit the story. It doesn't show progress. It shows loss. It shows that even at the height of imperial power, there were limits, and those limits were not always shared by the past. And this isn't the only place where we see this pattern. In the next video, we're going to cross the ocean to a small island in the Pacific. An island with no metal tools, no draft animals, no large trees. And yet standing there today is a stone structure weighing over 30 tons, lifted, locked, and aligned with the sun. Built by people history tells us should not have been capable of such a thing. But the stone is still standing, and it hasn't moved in 800 years. There is a moment in every investigation where distance stops mattering, where the idea that knowledge was isolated, trapped by oceans, continents, and time, quietly falls apart. Because when the same impossible questions appear on opposite sides of the world, something deeper is happening. In the middle of the Pacific Ocean, on an island that most people have never visited, there is a structure that should not exist. Not because it is large, but because of where it is, what it's made of, and who built it. This is Tonga. And this is the moment when the story leaves the familiar world behind. Tonga Tapu is flat, low, exposed, surrounded by open ocean in every direction. There are no mountains here, no deep forests, no metal deposits. For most of its history, the primary building materials available to the people of Tonga were wood, palm fronds, and coral limestone. And yet, standing alone near the eastern edge of the island is a stone monument weighing up to 40 tons. 3 massive slabs, 2 standing upright, 1 laid horizontally across the top, locked together using carved joints, not balanced, engineered. This structure is known as the Hamanga a Maui, often called the Stonehenge of the Pacific. And once you understand what you're looking at, the problem becomes obvious. Coral limestone is not forgiving. It's brittle, porous, prone to cracking under uneven stress. To carve it precisely, you must understand how force moves through the stone. To lift it, you must distribute weight evenly. To lock it into place using mortise and tenon joints, deep carved slots that prevent movement, you must plan every step before the stone ever leaves the ground. This is not accidental construction. It's controlled. And the stone isn't local to the site. It was quarried roughly a mile away, near the coast. That alone presents a problem. Moving a 30 to 40 ton stone across soft volcanic soil and sand is an engineering nightmare. Rollers sink. Sleds dig in. Friction increases exponentially. Tonga Tapu does not have the massive straight timber needed to create heavy-duty rollers like those used in temperate forests. Which means brute force alone doesn't explain this. History tells us the structure was built around the 13th century, during the height of the Tui Tonga Empire. This was not a primitive society. It was a maritime empire. Tongans traveled thousands of miles across open ocean using star navigation. They maintained political influence across Fiji, Samoa, and beyond. They were master sailors. But sailing skill does not automatically translate into stone engineering, unless something else was happening. Local legends claim the stones were carried from another island by the god Maui. That part is dismissed as myth. But the implication is not, because the legend doesn't say the stones were carved here. It says they were brought here. If that is even partially true, then the stones crossed open ocean. And that raises a staggering question. What kind of vessel can carry a 30-ton stone? Even today, wooden boats struggle with that kind of load. To move such weight safely, you would need a platform with massive displacement, likely a multi-hull structure. A floating system designed not just for travel, but for balance. Nothing like that has survived in the archaeological record. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, especially in tropical environments where organic materials decay rapidly. The engineering precision of the structure itself adds another layer. The lintel stone on top is not simply resting on the pillars. It is recessed into them. Slots were carved into the uprights, so the top stone could not slide or be knocked free. This is critical. Tonga is subject to earthquakes and cyclones. A simple stacked structure would fail over time. But this one hasn't. It has stood for over 8 centuries. That tells us the builders understood long-term structural stability. They were not experimenting. They were applying known principles. Then there is the alignment. In the 1960s, the Tongan king proposed that the monument functioned as a solar observatory. Subsequent studies confirmed it. The structure aligns precisely with the sunrise on the summer and winter solstices. Not approximately. Precisely. That requires astronomical observation over long periods. It requires a stable calendar. It requires an understanding of how the sun's position shifts throughout the year. This was not decorative architecture. It was functional. And it served a purpose critical to survival. For a maritime culture, tracking solstices is not ceremonial. It is navigational. Knowing the solar extremes allows navigators to calibrate star paths, to predict seasonal changes, to plan long voyages across thousands of miles of empty ocean. The Hamanga a Maui wasn't just stone. It was information, encoded into the landscape. Nearby, archaeologists have found stone platforms, paved paths, and imported materials. Basalt tools, stone not found on Tongatapu, were brought from other islands. Pottery fragments show connections across vast distances. This was not an isolated culture. It was part of a network that moved people, materials, and ideas across the Pacific long before European contact. And if they could move basalt across hundreds of miles, stone across 1 mile becomes less impossible, but still not easy. Here is where the official story struggles. If Tongans could do this, why don't we see transitional examples? Why don't we see smaller stone monuments evolving into larger ones? Why does this appear fully formed? Just like Barabar, just like Yangshan, the pattern repeats. Sudden mastery, no learning curve, and then silence. There is also a psychological dimension history often ignores. Why build this at all? Timber was abundant, easier, faster. Wood structures could be replaced, repaired, modified. Stone is permanent. Stone says, we are here to stay. In societies across the world, stone monuments appear during periods of consolidation, when power becomes centralized and identity needs to be anchored. The Hamanga a Maui was not just an observatory. It was a statement, a line drawn between earth and sky, between kingship and cosmos. But permanence comes at a cost. Stone demands precision. It punishes mistakes. And yet this structure shows no signs of correction. No collapsed uprights. No cracked joints. No emergency fixes. Which means the builders understood exactly what they were doing before they began. Once again, we are left with a contradiction. A culture officially classified as Late Stone Age, producing a monument that reflects advanced structural engineering and astronomical knowledge. A remote island society behaving like seasoned builders. And just like before, the tools don't match the work, which forces us to ask the same uncomfortable question. What if our categories are wrong? What if technological capability is not tied strictly to metal, writing, or cities? What if knowledge can exist and be lost independently of those things? Because when we place Tonga beside India and China, something begins to emerge. Different cultures, different materials, different environments, same outcome. Precision stonework, advanced planning, missing steps. And that pattern does not stop here. In the next video, we're going to travel back in time, far beyond kings, empires, or written records, to a place buried beneath desert sands, where people history calls nomads built something that required thousands of years of astronomical observation. A place that pushes civilization itself back into the Ice Age. There is a moment when the timeline breaks. Not bends, not stretches, breaks. A point where the story we've been taught can no longer hold the weight placed on it. Because far from empires, far from cities, far from writing, there is a place that should not exist, at least not when it does. A place built thousands of years before the pyramids, thousands of years before Stonehenge, thousands of years before agriculture was supposed to become organized. And yet what stands there is not crude. It is precise, intentional, mathematical. This place is called Nabta Playa, and it forces us to ask a question history has tried very hard to avoid. Today, Nabta Playa sits in one of the most unforgiving environments on Earth. Southern Egypt, near the Sudanese border. A windswept desert basin where summer temperatures can exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. The ground is cracked, dry, silent. It looks like a place where nothing could ever thrive. But 9,000 years ago, this region was very different. The Sahara was green. Seasonal rains filled shallow lakes. Grassland supported herds of cattle. Nomadic groups moved with the water, following predictable cycles. This was not a wasteland. It was a living landscape. And somewhere around 7000 BC, the people who lived here did something extraordinary. They began to build with stone. At first glance, Nabta Playa doesn't impress the way massive monuments do. There are no towering walls, no colossal statues, no grand temples. Instead, there are stones placed carefully into the earth. Standing stones, buried stones, aligned stones. And at the center of it all, a small stone circle barely 12 feet across. It's easy to underestimate it until you understand what it does. This stone circle is not decorative. It is not random. It is a calendar, but not the simple kind. It doesn't just mark the seasons. It tracks the movement of the stars. More specifically, it tracks precession, the slow wobble of Earth's axis. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Precession is not obvious. It is not something you notice over a year, or a decade, or even a lifetime. Earth's axis completes one full wobble roughly every 25,920 years. That means the stars shift position by only 1 degree every 72 years. To notice that shift, you need records, consistency, observation over many generations, which immediately raises a problem. How does a group described as nomadic cattle herders track something that requires centuries of precise data? The alignments at Nabta Playa are not approximate. They point to specific stars, including Orion and Sirius, as they appeared thousands of years ago. Computer simulations have confirmed this. The stones were positioned so that, at certain times of the year, specific stars rose exactly where the alignments indicate. This means the builders knew where those stars would appear long before they did. They weren't reacting. They were predicting. And prediction requires mathematics. There's more. The stones themselves were not local. Some weigh several tons and were transported from distant outcrops. Moving multi-ton stones across soft desert ground without wheels, draft animals, or metal tools is not trivial. And yet they did it. Repeatedly. With consistency. Which tells us this was not a one-time experiment. This was a system. When archaeologists first uncovered Nabta Playa in the 1970s, they weren't looking for an observatory. They stumbled upon it. Buried beneath sand were entire stone complexes. Not just one circle, but multiple alignments, stone lines, tumuli, mounded structures built over carefully placed stones. Some stones were shaped. Others were intentionally buried after being carved. That detail matters. You don't carve a stone and bury it unless it has meaning beyond function. This was ritualized science, a way of anchoring information to the land itself. Under some of the stones, archaeologists found cattle sacrifices. This fits with what we know about the culture. Cattle were central to survival. But under other stones, there were no remains. Just carefully placed sculpted rocks. Objects that appear symbolic. This tells us Nabta Playa was not just about survival. It was about understanding the world. Here's where the timeline really starts to crack. Mainstream history tells us that complex astronomical knowledge emerges with settled societies, with cities, writing, and agriculture. Nabta Playa predates all of that by thousands of years. At the time these stones were placed, humans were not supposed to be capable of long-term scientific planning. And yet this site suggests exactly that. It suggests a culture that valued data, that tracked cycles longer than a human life, that passed knowledge across generations without writing, which means their social structure had to be stable, organized, intentional. Now consider this. Nabta Playa did not exist in isolation. Just a few thousand years later, along the Nile, a civilization emerges with a fully formed understanding of astronomy, geometry, and stone construction. Egypt appears suddenly, not gradually, fully developed. For decades, historians asked, where did this knowledge come from? Nabta Playa may be the answer. As the Sahara dried, people were forced toward the Nile. They didn't come empty-handed. They brought their sky knowledge with them. The Orion correlation, the worship of stellar cycles, the idea that the heavens and earth were connected. These concepts didn't begin with the pharaohs. They were inherited. This reframes everything. Egyptian science was not invented from nothing. It was refined, which means civilization did not suddenly appear. It migrated. Another detail often overlooked is orientation. To align stones to true north without a compass requires stellar observation. You must watch the rotation of the sky night after night, year after year. That kind of precision does not come from intuition. It comes from method. And then there is the most unsettling implication of all. To understand precession, you must recognize that the stars are slowly changing position. But to recognize that, you must already believe the universe operates according to rules, that it is predictable, that it can be measured. This is not myth-based thinking. This is scientific thinking, appearing in the deep Neolithic. If Nabta Playa was built in phases, and evidence suggests it was, then different generations returned to this exact location for over 2,000 years. They updated the alignments, refined the placements, corrected for changes in the sky. That means this site outlived individual lives. It outlived families. It was a long-term project spanning centuries. This is not how nomads behave. This is how civilizations behave, which forces us to confront a hard truth. Our definition of civilization may be wrong. We associate it with cities, walls, and writing. But Nabta Playa suggests something older, a form of civilization centered on knowledge, not conquest, on observation, not expansion, on understanding cycles, not controlling land. The desert eventually reclaimed Nabta Playa. The rain stopped. The lakes dried. The people moved on. But the stones remained, buried, waiting. And when they were finally uncovered, they revealed something extraordinary. That the roots of science reach far deeper into the past than we ever imagined. This is not an isolated anomaly. It is part of a pattern. Advanced understanding appears early, then disappears, then reemerges. And when it reemerges, it is treated as new. In the next video, we're going to travel to one of the highest inhabited regions on Earth, to a place where stone blocks were cut with machine-like precision, where angles are perfect, where joints fit so tightly you can't slide a blade between them. A place where some believe the builders were working with stone, not carving it, but shaping it in ways we still can't explain. There are places in the world where the air itself reminds you that you are not meant to build there, where every movement feels heavier, where every breath takes effort, where survival alone demands respect. High on the Bolivian Altiplano, more than 12,000 feet above sea level, there is a site that ignores all of that. A place where stone was not just moved, but mastered. A place that looks less like an ancient ruin and more like the remains of an abandoned industrial project. This is Tiwanaku. And once you understand what was done here, the question is no longer who built it. The question becomes how. At this altitude, oxygen levels are significantly lower than at sea level. Even today, heavy labor in this environment is exhausting. Machines struggle, engines lose efficiency, humans fatigue quickly. Yet long before modern technology, someone transported massive stone blocks across this terrain. Not rough stones, finished ones. The most striking feature of Tiwanaku is not its size. It's its precision. Scattered across the site are stone blocks cut with such accuracy that they look machine-made. Perfect right angles, flat surfaces, internal corners that are truly 90 degrees. Not almost. Exact. These stones are not limestone. They are made from sandstone and andesite, volcanic rock harder than granite. Cutting andesite cleanly is difficult even with modern tools. And yet here, we find blocks shaped like components. Repeatable. Modular. Interlocking. This is especially visible at a nearby complex known as Pumapunku. Pumapunku doesn't look like traditional ancient architecture. There are no decorative carvings, no flowing shapes. Instead, there are blocks that look engineered. H-shaped stones with grooves, slots, and channels cut to precise dimensions. Some of these blocks were designed to be joined using metal clamps. Molten metal, likely copper or bronze, was poured into carved sockets to lock stones together. That alone is significant. It means the builders were not stacking stones. They were assembling them. To achieve this level of fit, the stones had to be shaped with extreme control. Internal right angles are especially telling. You cannot create a perfect internal corner with a hammer. It requires either grinding, drilling, or casting. And the surfaces show no signs of rough finishing. No chipping. No correction marks. Just clean geometry. The stone used for many of these blocks was quarried miles away. Some came from across Lake Titicaca. Transporting multi-ton stones across uneven ground at high altitude is already difficult. Doing so without cracking them is even harder. Sandstone fractures easily under uneven stress. Dragging it would likely destroy it, which means the transport method had to minimize vibration and torsion. That requires planning, engineering, experience. At the center of Tiwanaku stands a single figure carved from red sandstone. Known today as the Ponce monolith, it is 11 feet tall and covered in geometric patterns. At first glance, it looks ceremonial. But look closer and something feels strange. The patterns resemble grids, repeated motifs. The objects held in the figure's hands resemble tools more than symbols. Handles, edges, forms that feel functional. This doesn't look like abstract art. It looks like information. The site is also astronomically aligned. The Kalasasya temple functions as a massive solar calendar. Its cornerstones align with the sun during solstices. But here's the problem. When measured today, the alignment is slightly off. Not enough to be random. Enough to be noticeable. Using the known rate of Earth's axial tilt change, early researchers calculated that the temple aligns perfectly with the sun as it appeared around 15,000 BC. That date is controversial. It places the construction deep into the last ice age, long before agriculture, long before writing, long before civilization is supposed to exist. If that date is even partially correct, it changes everything. It means Tiwanaku is not a late Andean culture. It is a survivor, a remnant, the remains of something much older. The engineering methods here raise further questions. Some researchers have suggested that the builders did not carve the stones in the traditional sense. Instead, they may have used a form of geopolymer chemistry, a method where stone is broken down, mixed with mineral binders, and cast into molds. This would explain the uniformity, the perfect angles, the repeated shapes. It would also solve the transport problem. Instead of moving massive finished stones, Raw material could be moved in smaller quantities and formed on site. This idea remains controversial, but the results on the ground demand explanation. Other theories involve thermal softening. Local legends speak of a golden wedge that could soften stone. While this sounds mythical, some joints show signs of vitrification, surfaces that appear slightly melted or glassy. Extreme heat can do that. So can certain chemical reactions. Either way, the implication is the same. The builders understood material science at a level we do not associate with ancient cultures. The city itself was once a port. Lake Titicaca's shoreline has receded. Stone docks and canal systems remain far from the water today. This tells us the environment was different when Tiwanaku was active. It also tells us the builders planned for water transport. Boats, cargo, logistics. At 12,000 feet above sea level. Agriculture here was also engineered. Raised fields with water channels regulated soil temperature. Water absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, protecting crops from freezing. This is not trial and error farming. It is applied physics. So we have a city that uses advanced stone precision, employs modular construction, aligns with astronomical cycles, controls agriculture through engineering, functions in an extreme environment. And yet, history tells us it was built by a culture without metal tools, wheels, or written language. Once again, the tools do not match the work. Eventually, Tiwanaku was abandoned. The reasons are unclear. Climate change, earthquakes, social collapse. But what's clear is this: the level of stoneworking seen here was never repeated in the region. Later cultures built with smaller stones, less precision, less ambition. This suggests decline, not progress. Which brings us back to the pattern. Advanced capability appears, then disappears, then is remembered as myth. Standing among the ruins today, the stones feel unfinished. Not because they were poorly made, but because the system that created them vanished. Like finding the parts of a machine without the manual. Sometimes the strongest evidence doesn't come from monuments. It comes from mistakes. Small details left behind by a process so familiar to its creators that they didn't think to hide it. In Egypt, the story we are told focuses on scale. The Great Pyramid, the Sphinx, the temples. We are taught to be overwhelmed by size. But if you look closer at the stone itself, something far more unsettling begins to appear. Because scattered across the Giza Plateau, carved directly into some of the hardest rock on Earth, are marks that do not belong to hand tools. They belong to machines. Granite is unforgiving. It resists pressure. It blunts metal. It fractures if stressed incorrectly. Even today, cutting granite efficiently requires hardened steel, diamond tips, and powerful motors. And yet at Giza, granite was not just shaped. It was machined. The evidence is subtle. You won't notice it from a distance. But once you know what to look for, it becomes impossible to ignore. Inside the Great Pyramid and in surrounding temples, there are drill holes cut into rose granite. Not shallow depressions. Deep cylindrical holes. And inside those holes are spiral grooves. Perfectly consistent. Evenly spaced. These spirals are not decorative. They are a byproduct. When a modern drill cuts into a hard material, it leaves behind a pattern called a feed rate. This is the distance the drill advances with each rotation. The faster the feed rate, the more force is being applied. In the late 1800s, an engineer and archaeologist carefully measured these grooves. What he found was shocking. The drill that cut these holes advanced through granite at a rate hundreds of times faster than what is achievable with modern diamond drills under comparable conditions. This was not slow abrasion. It was penetration. The official explanation is that ancient Egyptians used copper tubes with sand as an abrasive. The sand would slowly grind the stone as the tube rotated. This method does work eventually, but it leaves a very specific signature: smooth, shallow scratches, irregular depth, inconsistent spacing. That is not what we see at Giza. What we see are deep, continuous spirals. Clean, uniform, unbroken. To produce that, the cutting edge must be harder than the granite itself, and the force driving it must be immense. Copper is soft. It deforms under pressure. It cannot maintain a sharp cutting edge against granite. Even with sand, it cannot explain the speed or consistency of these cuts. The math simply doesn't work. Then there are the saw marks. On granite blocks used throughout the plateau, there are long, straight cuts that run for several feet. Some show clear overcuts, places where the saw went too far. Just like a modern machine operator misjudging a stop point. The striations within these cuts are parallel and evenly spaced. That only happens when a blade is rigidly fixed. A handheld tool would wobble. Human muscle cannot maintain that level of consistency over long distances. Even more telling are the run-out marks. These are faint arcs where a circular saw exits the stone. They indicate a blade of significant diameter, several feet across. A blade that was spinning with controlled speed. Again, this is not what abrasive sanding looks like. This is what cutting looks like. There is also the issue of volume. The Great Pyramid alone contains millions of tons of stone. A significant portion of it is granite. If copper tools and sand were used, the amount of copper required would be enormous. Copper wears down quickly when cutting granite. For every inch of stone cut, several inches of copper are lost. This would require mining and processing quantities of copper far beyond what we find in the archaeological record. And it would produce massive amounts of copper-laden waste. That waste has not been found. Instead, what we find is efficiency. Clean cuts, minimal tool wear, standardized results. The kind of output you expect from an industrial process. Inside the Great Pyramid, the granite coffer in the king's chamber provides another clue. It is hollowed from a single block. The interior corners are sharp. The surfaces are flat. Measurements show tolerances within a few thousandths of an inch. Even modern stone workshops struggle to achieve that without computer-guided equipment. And yet this was done over 4,000 years ago. There are also overlapping drill marks, places where one drill hole slightly intersects another. This tells us the drilling was planned but not perfect. Which is important. It means the builders were not hiding their methods. They were comfortable with them. They didn't expect future generations to question how the work was done. Why would they? To them, this was normal. The mainstream narrative avoids these details, not because they are unknown, but because they are inconvenient. They don't fit the image of primitive laborers dragging stones with ropes. They point to something else entirely. Some researchers have proposed that the Egyptians used tools tipped with corundum or emery, minerals harder than granite. That could explain durability, but it does not explain feed rate. Hardness alone does not create speed. Speed requires force. Force requires energy. And the amount of energy implied by these cuts is enormous. This leads to uncomfortable possibilities. High-pressure drilling systems, mechanical presses, vibration-assisted cutting, even sonic methods. All speculative, but all more consistent with the evidence than copper tubes and sand. It's important to understand what this means. We are not talking about one strange mark or one anomaly. These features are found across the plateau. They are consistent, repeated, standardized. This was the method, not the exception. And here is the most important point. Later Egyptian dynasties did not replicate this precision. As time went on, stonework became rougher, less exact. Granite use declined. If technology only moves forward, this should not happen. But it did, which suggests loss, not progress. The Old Kingdom may represent a peak, a moment when a specific body of knowledge existed, then faded, leaving behind monuments that later cultures could admire, but not reproduce. The Giza Plateau is often described as a tomb complex. But if you ignore the mythology and focus on the stone, it begins to look like something else. A construction site. A place where advanced tools were used openly. Where speed and efficiency mattered. Where precision was expected. This doesn't mean the builders were modern in the way we understand it. It means they followed a different technological path. One that did not survive. When you step back and look at the pattern, India, China, the Pacific, South America, North Africa, the same theme repeats. Early mastery, later confusion, then myth. A stone so heavy that even today, lifting it would require machines most countries don't own. A stone placed by people who lived 6,000 years ago. And a question that remains unanswered. How did they lift it? Some monuments overwhelm you with size. Others overwhelm you with weight. And then there are those that do something far more unsettling. They overwhelm you with balance. In the rolling countryside of Ireland, where rain has fallen steadily for thousands of years, there is a single stone structure that quietly defies everything we think we know about early engineering. No massive city surrounds it. No towering walls. No inscriptions explaining its purpose. Just stone. And one slab so heavy that even today, lifting it safely would require specialized equipment. This is Brownshill Dolmen. And it should not be standing. At first glance, Brownshill looks like many other megalithic tombs scattered across Europe. A few upright stones. A capstone resting on top. Simple, quiet, ancient. But when archaeologists estimated the weight of that capstone, the entire story changed. The slab weighs between 100 and 150 tons. That makes it the heaviest capstone ever recorded in Europe. To understand what that means, imagine lifting a fully loaded blue whale and placing it gently onto 3 narrow points of contact. That is what was done here. 6,000 years ago. This structure dates to around 4000 BC. No metal tools. No wheels. No cranes, no draft animals capable of hauling such weight. And yet the stone was raised, not dropped, not tilted into place haphazardly. It was lifted and positioned with enough control that the supporting stones did not collapse. That detail matters, because under uneven load, stone fails. The most common explanation is the dirt ramp theory. Build a massive earthen ramp. Drag the stone upward. Place it. Remove the dirt. It sounds reasonable, until you do the math. To move a 150-ton stone up, even a shallow incline requires enormous force. The friction alone would exceed the tensile strength of ropes made from plant fibers or animal hide. Those ropes would snap long before the stone moved. Even if they somehow held, wooden rollers would be crushed under the pressure. Wood fibers collapse under extreme load. They don't roll. They flatten, and the soil beneath would compact and give way, meaning the entire system would fail. There's another problem. Space. To pull a stone of that weight, you would need hundreds, possibly over 1,000 people pulling at once. Where do they stand? How do they coordinate? How do they maintain even tension to prevent twisting or sudden shifts? The archaeological record shows no evidence of massive worker camps here. No signs of large-scale earthworks. No remnants of ramps large enough to support such a load. Brownshill appears almost isolated, which suggests the method was more refined. Some researchers believe the builders used incremental lifting, a technique involving levers and cribbing. Lift one side slightly. Insert stone or timber blocks. Repeat, slowly raising the stone inch by inch. This method requires far fewer people, but it demands deep understanding of leverage, center of gravity, and load distribution. You must know exactly how the stone will respond at each step. One mistake and the slab cracks or collapses. Yet the stone remains intact. Even more impressive is the placement itself. The capstone is not evenly balanced. It tilts, which means the builders intentionally placed it that way. They calculated where the center of mass would rest. They knew how much load each upright could bear. This is not guesswork. This is applied engineering. Then there is longevity. Brownshill has stood for over 6,000 years. It has endured rain, frost, ground movement, human interference. If the foundations were poorly prepared, the structure would have failed long ago. Instead, it remains stable. That tells us the builders understood long-term load behavior. They were not building for decades. They were building for millennia. And Brownshill is not alone. Across Ireland and Western Europe, there are other dolmens, Palnabrone, Prolec, and many more. Some are smaller. None are this heavy, but all reflect the same understanding. Stone can be moved. Stone can be lifted. Stone can be balanced. What makes Brownshill special is that it pushes the limit. It represents the upper boundary of what can be done using organic materials and human intelligence alone. If this truly is the maximum weight Neolithic builders could lift, then they reached that limit 6,000 years ago. And they did it without metal, without writing, without modern math. Or so we are told. But here's the deeper problem. If Neolithic builders understood leverage, load distribution, and long-term structural stability at this level, Why does later architecture often appear less ambitious? Why don't Bronze Age structures routinely match this scale? Why does precision sometimes decline rather than improve? This again suggests loss, not advancement. Brownshill is often described as a tomb, but no clear burial has been found beneath it. Its purpose remains uncertain. It may have been ceremonial, territorial, astronomical, or symbolic. What matters is not why it was built, but how. Standing beside it today, the stone feels out of place. Not because it's ancient, but because it feels deliberate, calculated, controlled. It does not feel like the result of brute force. It feels like the result of knowledge. Which brings us back to the recurring theme. We keep finding evidence of high-level engineering in places where history says it should not exist. And every time, the explanation leans on labor, on sheer numbers, on suffering. But labor alone does not create precision. It creates chaos. Precision requires planning. There is another uncomfortable thought here. What if these builders had methods we no longer use? Not because we advanced past them, but because we forgot them. Simple techniques, elegant techniques, ones that relied on understanding physics rather than overpowering it. Brownshill doesn't shout. It doesn't demand attention. It simply exists, quietly, patiently, challenging us to explain it honestly. And this challenge does not stop in Europe. In the next, we are going to travel to one of the coldest, most remote regions on Earth. A place where some of the largest stone blocks ever documented are stacked high on a mountain ridge. Blocks so heavy that even modern cranes would struggle to move them. A place where geology and archaeology collide, and where the line between natural formation and human construction becomes dangerously thin. There is a point where scale stops being impressive and starts being disturbing, where weight becomes so extreme that the mind instinctively rejects it, where explanation begins to feel like an excuse. In the remote mountains of southern Siberia, there is a place that exists almost entirely outside the modern conversation about ancient history. Not because it lacks importance, but because what stands there is too large, too strange, and too inconvenient to comfortably explain. This place is called Gornja Shoria. And if what we are seeing there is truly artificial, then it represents one of the greatest engineering achievements ever attempted by humans. Gornja Shoria sits in the Kemerova region of Russia, deep in a mountainous area that is difficult to access even today. The terrain is steep. The climate is harsh. Winters are long and unforgiving. For much of the year, the region is buried in snow and ice. According to conventional history, this area was once home only to small groups of hunter-gatherers. No cities, no agriculture, no metallurgy, no large-scale construction. And yet, rising along a mountain ridge are stone walls made of blocks so massive they defy comparison. Some of these blocks are estimated to weigh over 3,000 tons. That number is difficult to process. For context, the largest stones at Baalbek, often cited as the heaviest ever moved, weigh around 1,000 tons. These Siberian blocks are 3 times heavier. The walls stretch for hundreds of feet. They rise more than 100 feet high in places. And the stones are stacked. Not scattered. Not tumbled. Stacked. with flat faces, sharp edges, right angles. The seams between blocks are consistent. The overall structure resembles masonry, which is exactly why it unsettled so many researchers. Because nature can produce large stones, but nature rarely produces order at this scale. The mainstream explanation is geological, orthogonal jointing. This is a natural process where granite cools and fractures along perpendicular planes. Over millions of years, weathering can expose these blocks. In theory, this could create formations that look man-made. In theory. But when researchers examined the site more closely, the theory began to strain. Some blocks appear to be placed in alternating orientations. Long side, short side, long side. This pattern is known as heterostructure bonding. It is a technique used to strengthen walls by distributing load evenly. It is intentional. Nature does not optimize load distribution. There are also passage-like openings, rectangular gaps cut through the stacked blocks, with vertical sides, and flat lintels. These are not random fractures. Erosion does not carve doorways. Even more troubling are the surface details. Some blocks show signs of thermal alteration, burnt textures, scorched areas, zones where the granite appears partially vitrified, as if it was exposed to extreme heat. This is not typical of freeze-thaw erosion. It suggests concentrated energy. In several locations, there are deep, straight grooves cut into the stone. Not cracks. Grooves. Uniform in width. Consistent in depth. Running across multiple blocks. These look like tool marks, and they do not align with natural fracture patterns. Then there are the magnetic anomalies. Researchers have reported compass readings behaving erratically near certain sections of the wall. Spinning, reversing. Granite can contain magnetite. But what is strange here is how localized the effect is. The magnetic disturbances appear concentrated around the stacked sections, not the surrounding bedrock. That suggests alteration, not coincidence. The logistical implications are staggering. To move a 3,000-ton block today would require specialized crawler transporters, reinforced roads, hydraulic lifting systems. Gornia Shoria has none of that. The blocks sit on uneven mountain terrain. There is no evidence of roads, no platforms, no ramps, and yet the stones are elevated, placed, aligned. If we accept that these blocks were moved by humans, then we must also accept that the builders possessed a method for manipulating mass on a scale far beyond what we currently attribute to any ancient culture. Especially in this region, especially during the Ice Age or early post-Ice Age periods. Local indigenous legends speak of giants, beings of immense strength who built the walls in a distant age. These stories are usually dismissed as folklore, but similar legends appear near megalithic sites all over the world. Ireland, Malta, South America, the Pacific. The details chain. The theme does not. This does not mean giants existed, but it does suggest a cultural memory, a way of explaining something that later generations could not replicate. When technology is lost, it often becomes myth. Another overlooked detail is orientation. Some sections of the walls align with cardinal directions. Not perfectly, but deliberately. Enough to suggest planning, enough to suggest purpose. And then there is the absence of debris. If these walls are natural, we should see chaotic rubble, random collapse. Instead, we see order, balance, stability. Skeptics argue that the human mind is good at finding patterns, that we want to see intention where none exists. This is true, but it does not explain everything. Not the grooves, not the heat effects, not the openings, not the stacking. The uncomfortable reality is this. If Gornia Shoria is man-made, then it represents a civilization that existed where and when we least expect it. A civilization capable of moving weights that even modern industry avoids. A civilization that left behind its largest works, but none of its smaller ones. No tools, no settlements, no clear cultural trail, just stone. This creates a paradox. How can a culture capable of such feats leave so little behind? One possibility is time. If these structures are truly ancient, tens of thousands of years old, then organic materials would have decayed. Metals could have corroded. Wood would be gone. Stone would remain. Another possibility is catastrophe. Rapid climate change, floods, ice retreat. Events that wipe out infrastructure but leave immovable objects untouched. Stone walls survive. Societies do not. The problem is not that Gornia Shoria challenges one theory. It challenges our entire framework. We assume civilization requires agriculture, surplus cities. But what if a different model existed? One focused on energy, stone, knowledge, not population. At this point in the journey, the pattern is undeniable. India, China, the Pacific, Africa, South America, Europe, now Siberia. Different times, different cultures, same questions, same contradictions. We are not looking at isolated anomalies. We are looking at fragments, pieces of a story that has been broken apart by time. Now, we're going to travel to a small island in the Mediterranean. An island with no rivers, limited resources, and yet it hosts some of the oldest freestanding stone structures on Earth, including an underground complex carved with such precision that it behaves like an acoustic instrument. A place where sound was engineered, and where stone was used not just to build, but to alter the human mind. There are places where stone does more than stand, places where it responds, where the material itself seems to participate in what happens inside it. On a small island in the Mediterranean Sea, there is an underground structure carved thousands of years ago that does exactly that. It listens. It amplifies. It changes the way sound moves through the human body. This place is the Hal Saflieni Hypogeum of Malta, and it forces us to confront a different kind of ancient technology, one that doesn't rely on mass or force, but on frequency. Malta is not a forgiving island. It has no rivers, limited soil, no large forests. Every resource had to be managed carefully. And yet, between roughly 3600 and 2500 BC, the people of Malta built some of the oldest freestanding stone temples on Earth. Massive limestone blocks, walls weighing over 50 tons, structures older than the pyramids. But the most extraordinary work wasn't built upward. It was carved downward. The hypogeum lies more than 10 meters below the surface, 3 levels deep, hollowed directly into solid limestone. Not natural caves, designed spaces, rooms connected by corridors, doorways carved to resemble above-ground architecture, false beams, curved ceilings, carefully planned layouts. This was not an afterthought. It was a blueprint executed in stone. The discovery itself was accidental. In 1902, workers digging a cistern broke through the roof of an underground chamber. What they found beneath their feet was an entire hidden world. Excavations revealed a complex that had been sealed and forgot for thousands of years. Inside were the remains of thousands of individuals. But this was not simply a burial site. It was something else entirely. One room in particular changes everything. Known today as the Oracle Room, it contains a small carved niche in the wall. At first, it looks unremarkable, until you speak into it. When a low-pitched voice enters that niche, the sound does not fade. It resonates deeply, powerfully. It fills the entire complex, and the stone itself begins to vibrate. Modern acoustic testing revealed something remarkable. The chamber resonates most strongly at around 110 Hz. This is not random. That frequency interacts directly with the human nervous system. Studies show that exposure to sustained sound around this range can alter brain activity, reducing stress, inducing trance-like states, enhancing focus. The builders of the hypogeum didn't just carve stone. They tuned it. This is not accidental acoustics. Random caves do not produce consistent resonance. This required experimentation, understanding how sound reflects, how curves affect vibration, how chamber size changes frequency, which means the builders were not guessing. They were refining. The limestone used here plays a critical role. Freshly cut limestone is soft, easy to shape, but once exposed to air, it hardens. This gave the builders a limited window to carve with precision, and they used that window expertly. Walls are symmetrical. Rooms are balanced. Proportions are consistent across multiple levels. This level of planning is astonishing for a culture with no written language. Then there is the silence. No weapons have been found associated with Malta's temple period. No fortifications. No defensive structures. Instead, the entire culture appears focused on ritual, art, and architecture, on understanding life, and perhaps consciousness. Stone figurines found in the hypogeum depict human forms with rounded bodies. Peaceful, reclining. One figure, known as the Sleeping Lady, lies curled on her side as if in deep rest. Some researchers believe these figures represent the mental state induced within the chambers. Others believe they reflect a culture focused on fertility and regeneration. Either way, the message is consistent. This was not a society obsessed with war. It was a society exploring the inner world. The acoustic properties were not limited to one room. Sound moves differently throughout the complex. Some chambers dampen it. Others amplify it. The layout creates zones, spaces designed for different experiences. This suggests intentional use. Perhaps chance, Perhaps rituals, perhaps something we no longer fully understand. The temples above ground mirror this same precision. Structures like Hagar Kim and Najdra are aligned with the sun. On equinoxes and solstices, sunlight passes through doorways and illuminates specific stones. This required long-term observation. It required planning over generations. The same theme we have seen again and again. Then there are the cart ruts. Across Malta, deep parallel grooves are carved into the bedrock. Thousands of them. They run across the island, over hills, through valleys. Some lead directly off cliffs and continue underwater. They do not match animal tracks. They are too narrow and too deep. Their purpose remains unknown, but their presence suggests heavy transport. On an island with limited resources, sea levels were lower at the end of the last ice age. Some researchers believe Malta was once part of a larger landmass. If true, the temples and ruts may be remnants of a much older landscape. One partially submerged, one partially erased. The hypogeum itself was intentionally sealed, carefully backfilled, protected, as if the builders knew it was time to leave, or time to hide what they had created. This act of burial preserved the structure for millennia. It also suggests awareness, a consciousness of legacy. Once again, we encounter the same contradiction. A culture officially described as Neolithic farmers producing architecture that integrates structural engineering, astronomical alignment, acoustic science, human psychology, all without metal tools, without writing, without cities. At this point, the question is no longer whether ancient people were intelligent. That is obvious. The question is whether our timeline accurately reflects when advanced knowledge existed. Because it keeps appearing too early and disappearing too completely. Sound like stone leaves traces. But unlike stone, it also affects the body. The hypogeum reminds us that ancient technology was not always about domination or expansion. Sometimes it was about experience, transformation, understanding the relationship between matter and mind. This raises a final, unsettling thought. What if some ancient cultures measured progress not by how much they could build, but by how deeply they could feel? The temples of Malta were abandoned around 2500 BC. The culture vanished. No clear explanation. But the stone remained, silent, waiting. And when rediscovered, it revealed something modern society had forgotten. That technology does not always look like machines. Sometimes it looks like harmony. To a landscape of stone pillars carved more than 12,000 years ago. A place that forces us to confront the possibility that organized, large-scale construction existed before agriculture. A place that may represent the true beginning of civilization. There is one idea that sits at the foundation of modern history. One assumption so deeply embedded that nearly everything else depends on it. The belief that civilization begins with agriculture. That people must first settle, farm, and store food before they can build monuments, organize labor, or develop complex ideas. But what happens when we find a place that reverses that order? A place where monumental construction appears before farming, before cities, before pottery, before metal, before writing. In southeastern Turkey, on a series of low limestone hills, there is a site that forces us to reconsider where civilization truly begins. This place is Göbekli Tepe, and nearby, an even stranger site pushes the question further. The region is known today as Taş Tepeler, the Stone Hills. At first glance, the landscape looks ordinary. Rolling terrain, sparse vegetation. Nothing about it suggests global importance. And for thousands of years, it went unnoticed. Not because it was hidden underground by accident, but because it was deliberately buried. Göbekli Tepe dates to around 9600 BC. That is more than 11,000 years ago. At that time, humans were supposed to be hunter-gatherers. Small groups, temporary shelters, no permanent architecture. And yet, carved into the limestone bedrock are massive stone enclosures, circular and oval spaces, each filled with towering stone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, carved with precision, decorated with reliefs, planned. The pillars are T-shaped. This is not a structural necessity. It is a symbolic choice. And once you recognize what the shape represents, everything changes. The T-shape resembles a stylized human figure. The horizontal top is shoulders. The vertical shaft is a body. Some pillars even have arms carved along their sides, hands resting at the front. These are not abstract forms. They are representations. The carvings on the pillars are equally unsettling. Foxes, snakes, boars, scorpions, birds, all rendered in high relief. Clean lines, confident execution. This is not crude art. This is experienced craftsmanship. And it appears suddenly, fully developed. What makes this site extraordinary is not just the carving. It is the organization required to build it. To quarry a 20-ton stone pillar, shape it, transport it, and raise it upright requires coordination. Dozens of people, possibly hundreds, working together, following a plan. This is not spontaneous behavior. It is structured. Yet there is no evidence of permanent housing. No hearths, no storage pits, no agricultural tools. The people who built Göbekli Tepe did not live there. They came there, which means this was not a village. It was a destination. Even more unsettling is what happened next. After centuries of use, the builders deliberately buried the entire site. They filled the enclosures with rubble and soil. Carefully, completely. This act preserved the site. It also suggests intention, a decision to end something, or protect it. Nearby, another site pushes this mystery further. Gaziantep, discovered more recently. Less famous, but in some ways more revealing. Gaziantep features hundreds of stone pillars carved directly from the bedrock. Not placed, carved in place. Some remain attached to the floor. Others rise freely. And among them is a chamber unlike anything else. A sunken space with upright stone forms emerging from the ground. 11 of them, phallic in shape, surrounding a central void. And watching over it all is a carved human head emerging from the wall. A face, staring across the chamber. This is not decoration. It is theatrical. The space was designed to be experienced, to be entered, To be felt. Light enters the chamber in specific ways. Shadows move across the stone. This was intentional architecture, built more than 12,000 years ago. At this time, humans were not supposed to have the social structure necessary for this kind of project. But the stone does not care what we think. The stone exists. There is no evidence of hierarchy in the traditional sense. No palaces, no elite burials. Yet the labor investment here is enormous, which suggests cooperation rather than coercion, shared purpose rather than force, a different model of organization. What if the first monuments were not built to control people? What if they were built to bring people together? This flips the traditional narrative. Instead of agriculture creating civilization, civilization may have created agriculture. Large gatherings require food. Food requires planning. Planning leads to cultivation, not the other way around. At Göbekli Tepe, we see the earliest evidence of symbolic thought expressed at scale. Shared myth, shared ritual, shared identity. Stone was the medium. Then there is the question of knowledge. These builders understood geometry. The enclosures are not random. They are laid out with symmetry, with measured spacing, with consistent proportions. They understood how to carve limestone efficiently, how to move it, how to raise it. And yet they left behind no tools, no metal, no writing, only stone. The pillars themselves were not all identical. Each enclosure is unique, which suggests experimentation, iteration, learning, and yet the skill level is already high. There is no crude phase, no early mistakes. Once again, mastery appears fully formed. Eventually, the entire complex was buried, not abandoned to decay, intentionally sealed. Just like Malta, just like Nabta Playa. This pattern repeats. Advanced sites are closed, hidden, left behind. Why? One possibility is environmental change. The end of the last ice age was a time of instability. Rapid warming, floods, shifting ecosystems. The world these builders knew was disappearing. Perhaps these sites belonged to a worldview that no longer fit the new reality. Another possibility is cultural transition. As agriculture took hold, social priorities changed. Permanent settlement, property, hierarchy. The old ways may have been deliberately set aside, buried. Whatever the reason, the result is the same. The knowledge embodied in these stones did not carry forward directly. It fragmented, reappeared later in different forms. This brings us to an uncomfortable realization. Civilization may not have a single starting point. It may be cyclical, emerging, collapsing, re-emerging, each time leaving traces. Göbekli Tepe and Karahantepe are not anomalies. They are reminders that humans were capable of complex thought long before we expected. That cooperation can precede conquest. That monument building does not require kings, only shared meaning. As we near the end of this journey, the picture becomes clearer. Not complete, but clearer. Advanced knowledge has appeared many times, in many places, often earlier than we are taught. and often vanished without explanation. We are going to revisit everything we've seen so far. Not to summarize, but to connect, to look at the patterns that link these sites together, and to ask one final question. If all of this is true, what kind of world existed before the one we remember? By now, something should feel different. Not confused, not overwhelmed, but unsettled. Because what we've been looking at piece by piece is no longer random. India, China, the Pacific, Africa, South America, Europe, Siberia, the Mediterranean, Anatolia, different cultures, different climates, different time periods, and yet the same questions keep resurfacing. Not once, not twice, again and again. At first, it's easy to dismiss each site on its own. One strange cave, one unfinished quarry, one anomalous stone monument. But when you line them up side by side, a pattern emerges that history does not know how to process. Because the pattern does not follow the story we were taught. Let's step back, not to summarize but to connect. What do all of these sites have in common? Not myth, not speculation, physical traits. First, precision appears suddenly. At Barabar, granite is polished to a mirror finish with no learning curve. At Tiwanaku, stone blocks are cut with perfect right angles from the start. At Göbekli Tepe, carving skill appears fully developed, not experimental. There is no crude phase, no visible progression. Mastery shows up already complete. Second, the tools do not match the work. Iron chisels cannot polish granite like glass. Copper tubes cannot drill granite at extreme feed rates. Stone hammers cannot create modular blocks with internal angles. Wooden rollers cannot move 100-ton stones with precision. This mismatch appears everywhere. Not once, everywhere. Third, advanced sites often predate expectations. Nabta Playa predates dynastic Egypt. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture. Malta's temples predate Stonehenge and the pyramids. Tiwanaku may predate known Andean civilizations by millennia. Time and again, capability appears too early. Fourth, knowledge disappears. Later cultures inherit the monuments but cannot replicate them. Later Egyptians admire Old Kingdom precision but never match it. Later Andean cultures reuse Tiwanaku stones but cannot reproduce them. Later Europeans never lift capstones as heavy as Brownshill again. Technology does not steadily improve. It retreats. Fifth, sites are intentionally buried or abandoned. Göbekli Tepe is sealed. Karahantepe is buried. The hypogeum is closed. Nabta Playa is left to the desert. These were not chaotic collapses. They were deliberate endings. And finally, stone is chosen over convenience. Wood was easier. Mud brick was faster. Smaller stones were more practical. Yet again and again, builders chose massive stone. Not because it was efficient, but because it was permanent. When you put these traits together, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. This was not accidental construction. This was not trial and error. This was not the result of brute labor alone. It was the expression of a worldview. A worldview that treated stone as something more than material. Stone as memory. Stone as data. Stone as anchor. Consider this. Stone is the one material that survives catastrophe. Floods wash away wood. Fire consumes organic matter. Metal corrodes. Cities collapse. Stone remains. If you wanted to leave a message for the future, or preserve knowledge beyond your own lifetime, stone is the obvious choice. Now ask yourself this: what kind of civilization would prioritize that? Not speed, not expansion, but endurance. One possibility is that these cultures had already experienced collapse, that they understood impermanence, that they knew knowledge could be lost, and so they encoded it into the landscape, into geometry, into alignments, into acoustics, into scale. This would explain something else we keep encountering: why these sites often seem symbolic rather than practical, why they align with stars, why they respond to sound, why they emphasize balance and proportion. These were not factories. They were not homes. They were interfaces between humans and something larger. There is another layer to this pattern that is rarely discussed: energy. Not electricity as we define it, but interaction, resonance, vibration, pressure, frequency. At Barabar, sound is amplified. At Malta, specific frequencies alter perception. At Giza, vibration-assisted drilling is implied. At Tiwanaku, stone joints suggest thermal or chemical manipulation. These builders were not just shaping stone. They were working with forces. This does not mean they had modern machines. It means they may have understood principles we no longer emphasize. Principles that do not require fossil fuels or digital systems. Principles based on observation, iteration, long-term thinking. Now consider what happens when such a civilization faces rapid environmental change. The end of the last ice age was not gentle. Sea levels rose over 300 feet. Coastlines vanished. Rivers shifted. Ecosystems collapsed. Any civilization tied to a specific landscape would be devastated. Knowledge would fragment. Survivors would carry pieces forward. Stories, symbols, practices, but the full system would be gone. What we might be seeing in later civilizations is not invention, but inheritance. Fragments of something older, misunderstood, reinterpreted. This could explain why later cultures often mythologize earlier builders. Gods, giants, culture heroes. Not because those builders were supernatural, but because they represented a level of understanding that later societies could no longer access. And here is the most important implication of all. If civilization has risen and fallen before, not once, but multiple times, then history is not a straight line. It is a cycle. Peaks, loss, recovery, forgetting. This does not diminish humanity. It elevates it. It means intelligence and creativity are ancient. It means we are not the first to ask big questions, and we may not be the last to lose the answers. There is a reason these stories feel uncomfortable. They challenge identity. We like to believe we stand at the top of a long climb, that everything before us was simpler. But what if we are standing on a plateau, looking back at peaks we barely remember? At this stage, denial becomes harder than acceptance. The evidence does not point to one lost civilization. It points to a recurring human capability, one that emerges under certain conditions and disappears under others, which raises a final, quiet question. If these cycles are real, what stage are we in now? We're going to confront the most difficult aspect of this entire investigation. Not the stones, not the dates, but the resistance. Why these ideas remain marginalized, why the conversation is avoided, and what it reveals about how knowledge is controlled, not just in the past, but today. At this point, the question is no longer what we are seeing. The question becomes why we are not supposed to see it. Because the evidence we've examined so far is not hidden. It's not secret. It's not forbidden. It exists in open air, in museums, in textbooks, in peer-reviewed papers. And yet, the larger implications are almost never discussed. Not seriously, not publicly. That silence is not accidental. Most people assume that when an idea is ignored, it's because it lacks evidence. But history works differently. Ideas are often ignored because they don't fit. Not because they are wrong, but because they force us to rethink too much at once. Modern archaeology, like any field, is built on structure. Timelines, periods, categories, Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. These labels are not neutral. They are organizing tools. They allow thousands of discoveries to be placed into a coherent story. And once that story is built, changing it becomes very difficult. Imagine pulling on one thread. If Göbekli Tepe shows organized construction before agriculture, then agriculture is no longer the foundation of civilization. If Nabta Playa shows astronomy before cities, then cities are no longer the birthplace of science. If Giza shows machining marks, then the assumed limits of ancient technology collapse. Each adjustment ripples outward. Textbooks change. Curricula change. Funding priorities change. Entire careers become unstable. This does not require conspiracy. It requires inertia. Institutions, by design, resist radical revision. Not out of malice, but out of survival. There is also the issue of specialization. Modern researchers are trained to focus narrowly. A geologist studies rock formation. An archaeologist studies artifacts. An engineer studies mechanics. But the most troubling questions exist between these fields. The marks on stone are mechanical, not cultural. The alignments are astronomical, not architectural. The acoustic effects are neurological, not ritualistic. When evidence crosses boundaries, it often falls through gaps. Take the drill marks at Giza. An engineer sees feed rates and torque. A traditional archaeologist sees context and chronology. They are trained to ask different questions. And often, they do not speak the same language. There is also a deeper discomfort at play. These findings challenge not just history, but identity. We define ourselves by progress, by the idea that we are more advanced than those who came before us. Technology reinforces that belief. But if earlier cultures mastered techniques we no longer understand, then progress is not guaranteed. And that idea is unsettling. There is another factor rarely acknowledged. The public narrative of history is simplified for clarity. It must be teachable. Linear stories are easier to remember. Primitive to advanced is intuitive. Cycles are not. Loss is not. Now consider how these ideas are often presented outside academia. Sensational headlines, extreme claims, aliens, Atlantis. When legitimate anomalies are lumped together with speculation, serious discussion suffers. Reasonable skepticism turns into dismissal, which benefits no one. This creates a strange situation. Mainstream academia avoids the topic because it attracts sensationalism. The public distrusts academia because it avoids the topic, and the space between fills with noise. But there is a quiet shift happening. Slowly, carefully, new generations of researchers are revisiting old sites with modern tools. Laser scanning, acoustic modeling, material analysis. And each time, the data becomes harder to ignore. Consider Göbekli Tepe again. When it was first discovered, it was dismissed. Too early, too advanced. But the stone didn't change. The interpretation did. The same may eventually happen elsewhere. But change in science is not dramatic. It is gradual, measured, sometimes frustratingly slow. There is also a psychological barrier. If ancient knowledge existed and was lost, it raises uncomfortable questions about fragility, about collapse, about our own future. It suggests that complexity can disappear, that resilience is not guaranteed, that civilization is not permanent. That idea runs counter to modern optimism. So we resist it. Another overlooked factor is modern bias toward material technology. We value machines, engines, electronics. But ancient technology often worked differently. It relied on observation, sound, geometry, environment. These are harder to quantify, harder to patent, harder to reproduce. The hypogeum doesn't impress with size. It impresses with effect. You cannot see resonance. You must feel it. And modern science has only recently begun to study how sound affects the brain. What ancient builders explored intuitively, we are now rediscovering clinically. There is also the problem of evidence standards. We often demand physical artifacts, tools, machines, written instructions. But what if the technology was procedural? What if knowledge was transmitted orally? What if tools were simple, but techniques were refined? In that case, the method disappears when the people do. Stone remains. This may explain why we keep finding the result, but not the process. Perfect stonework. No tools. Now consider the scale of time. 10,000 years is a long time. Wood rots. Leather decays. Metal corrodes. Even iron does not last. Expecting full toolkits to survive from deep prehistory is unrealistic. Stone is the exception. So what we are left with is asymmetrical evidence. Stone without context, which makes interpretation difficult, but not impossible. The resistance to these ideas is not proof they are wrong. It is proof they are disruptive. And disruptive ideas take time. We have seen this before. Continental drift was ridiculed for decades. The idea that meteor impacts caused mass extinctions was dismissed. The notion that ancient humans interbred with other hominins was once unthinkable. until evidence forced change. History is not immune to revision. It is simply slower to adapt. There is one more reason this story remains on the margins. It lacks a clear ending. No single lost city. No neat conclusion. Just fragments. Questions. Possibilities. And that makes it uncomfortable. But discomfort is often where truth begins. At this point, the silence around these sites tells us as much as the sites themselves. It tells us where the boundaries of accepted thought still lie, and how fragile our certainty really is. Not to analyze, but to ask a final human question. If these structures were built by people like us, what were they trying to preserve? After everything we've seen, one question remains. Not a technical one, not a historical one, a human one. Why? Why did people who lived thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of years ago, invest such enormous effort into stone? Why carve mountains? Why move impossible weights? Why align structures to stars that move over centuries? Why shape sound, balance mass, and bury sites with care? What were they trying to leave behind? At first, it's tempting to say power. Kings, gods, authority. But that explanation starts to fall apart the closer you look. Many of these sites show no clear signs of hierarchy. No palaces, no thrones, no elite tombs. Instead, we see shared spaces, gathering places, sites that required cooperation rather than control, which suggests a different motivation. Survival is another common explanation. Calendars to track seasons, observatories to predict floods, structures to protect food or people. Some sites certainly served practical functions, but practicality alone cannot explain the scale, or the precision, or the permanence. You do not need mirror-polished granite to survive. You do not need 100-ton capstones to mark time. You do not need acoustically tuned chambers to store grain. Something else was happening. To understand it, we need to step outside modern thinking. We live in a world of speed. Updates, replacements, short lifespans for tools and ideas. Ancient cultures did not. Their world moved slowly. Generations lived and died without dramatic change, which meant time was experienced differently. When you think in centuries rather than years, permanence matters. Memory matters. Continuity matters. Stone is not just durable. It is patient. It waits. Imagine living in a world without writing. No books. No digital records. No archives. If you wanted to preserve knowledge beyond your lifetime, how would you do it? You would embed it in the landscape, in alignments, in proportions, in patterns that repeat, knowledge that can be rediscovered. Not read, but experienced. This may be why so many ancient sites are experiential. You don't just look at them. You enter them. You stand in them. You feel them. Sound moves through you. Light strikes specific stones. Shadows shift in deliberate ways. These are not passive messages. They are interactive. At the Hypogeum, sound alters perception. At Göbekli Tepe, stone figures surround you. At Nabta Playa, the sky itself becomes part of the structure. At Barabar, resonance turns whisper into force. These are not monuments meant to be admired from afar. They are places meant to be used. Used for what? Possibly ritual, possibly teaching, possibly initiation, possibly something we no longer have a word for. Consider the idea of knowledge transmission. Modern education relies on abstraction. Text, symbols, equations. Ancient education may have relied on immersion. You don't explain the movement of the stars. You show it. You don't describe resonance. You experience it. You don't talk about balance. You feel the weight settle. This kind of learning leaves no manuals behind, but it leaves architecture. Now consider the act of burial. Again and again, we see advanced sites deliberately sealed. Not destroyed, not abandoned haphazardly, but closed, carefully, as if the builders knew their time had passed, or that the knowledge should rest until rediscovered. Why not pass it directly? Why not teach successors? Because something may have changed. Environment, population, belief systems. The old methods may no longer have worked, or may no longer have been understood. This brings us to a difficult possibility, that some ancient knowledge was context-dependent. It worked within a specific worldview, a specific relationship between humans and nature. Once that relationship changed, the knowledge lost meaning. Agriculture may be part of that shift. When humans settled permanently, priorities changed. Ownership, boundaries, accumulation, time compressed, the long view shortened. What mattered was next year's harvest, not the next century. In that world, stone temples became less relevant. Why build for eternity when you are focused on seasons? Why encode the stars when fields demand attention? The builders of these ancient sites may have belonged to a different mindset, one that valued alignment over domination, harmony over extraction, cycles over growth. This is not romanticism. It is observation. Their structures emphasize balance, symmetry, integration with landscape. They rarely dominate the environment. They converse with it. Now consider the emotional weight of this. Imagine realizing that the world you understand is changing beyond recognition. Climate shifts, floods, drying landscapes, ways of life ending. What would you do? You would try to preserve what matters. You would try to anchor memory. Stone becomes an act of hope, a belief that someone someday will stand where you stood. Look where you looked. Ask the same questions. This reframes ancient monuments, not as displays of power, but as messages across time. And what is the message? Not instructions, not warnings, but reminders that humans once paid close attention to the sky, to sound, to proportion, to time. These structures tell us that ancient people were not obsessed with domination. They were obsessed with understanding their place in a vast system. There is one more reason stone was chosen. Stone resists rewriting. Texts can be altered. Stories can be changed. Stone is stubborn. It does not care who controls the narrative. It simply exists, which may be why these sites feel confrontational. They challenge our assumptions without saying a word. They don't argue. They wait. Standing inside one of these places today, you don't feel small. You feel connected, as if the distance between past and present collapses, as if someone long gone anticipated your presence. This may be the most unsettling realization of all, that these builders expected us, not specifically, but generically. Future humans, questioning humans, curious humans. They built for us to find, not to worship, not to obey, but to remember. Remember that knowledge can be lost, that civilization is fragile, that progress is not guaranteed, that understanding must be renewed. At this point, the stones have done their job. They have carried their message across time. They have reached us. The question is no longer what they were trying to say. The question is whether we are willing to listen. Now we will step back one last time. Not to speculate, but to reflect on what this story means for how we see ourselves, our past, and our future. There is a moment near the end of any long journey when the noise finally fades. The questions slow down. The urgency dissolves. And what remains is not an answer, but a feeling. That feeling is where this story ends. We began with stone that should not exist. Caves polished like mirrors. Blocks weighing more than modern machines like to move. Alignments older than civilization itself. We followed these traces across continents and millennia. We asked how. We asked when. We asked why. But now, standing at the edge of the evidence, another question quietly takes its place. What does this mean for us? Not for archaeology. Not for textbooks. For us, the people living now. It is tempting to see these ancient structures as relics, as echoes of a distant, finished past. But the more closely we look, the less finished they appear. They are not conclusions. They are interruptions. Moments where history stops making sense and asks us to pause. Consider what these stones have endured. Ice ages, floods, droughts, earthquakes, the rise and fall of empires. They have outlasted languages, outlasted belief systems, outlasted entire ways of life. And they did so without moving, without adapting, without changing. They simply remained. This permanence is not accidental. It is the defining feature. And it carries a quiet implication. Everything we build today is designed to be temporary. Phones replaced every few years. Buildings designed for decades. Data stored on fragile media. We move fast. We upgrade. We discard. Ancient builders did the opposite. They slowed down. They invested enormous effort into creating things that would not need replacement. Not because they were inefficient, but because they thought differently about time. They lived closer to cycles. Seasonal cycles, astronomical cycles, climatic cycles. They saw patterns that stretched beyond a single lifetime, and they responded accordingly. What if that is the lesson we have been missing? Not lost machines, not forgotten technologies, but a lost relationship with time. Modern civilization measures success in growth. More energy, more production, more speed. Ancient monument builders measured success in alignment with the land, with the sky, with human experience. This does not mean one approach is morally superior, but it does mean they solve different problems. And when circumstances change, different approaches matter. The end of the last ice age reshaped the planet. Coastlines vanished. Ecosystems collapsed. Human populations were forced to adapt quickly or perish. In moments like that, flexibility matters. But so does memory. Stone monuments may have served as anchors. Not just physical ones. Cultural ones. Places where knowledge could survive chaos. Not in written form, but in structure, in experience. This suggests something important, that the builders of these sites were not naive. They were not blindly optimistic. They understood fragility. They understood loss. They understood that civilizations can fail. And that understanding shaped their choices. Now look at our own moment in history. Rapid climate change. Global systems under strain. Technology advancing faster than social structures can absorb. We often assume that our complexity protects us, that our systems are too interconnected to fail completely. But complexity cuts both ways. It enables great power and great vulnerability. The ancient sites we've explored do not offer instructions for survival. They offer something subtler. Perspective. They remind us that intelligence is not new, that creativity is not recent, that humans have solved difficult problems before, and also lost the solutions. This should not frighten us. It should humble us. Humility opens space for learning, for asking better questions, for paying attention to what lasts. Stone lasts, but not because it is indestructible, because it does not depend on constant maintenance. It does not require energy input. It does not need to be updated. Our modern world is powerful but fragile. It requires continuous effort to sustain, continuous energy, continuous coordination. If that effort falters, much of what defines our civilization disappears quickly. Ancient builders may have understood this trade-off and chosen a different balance. Now consider something else. Despite all the mystery, despite the unanswered questions, these ancient sites do not feel hostile. They do not warn. They do not threaten. They do not demand. They simply exist. They allow us to arrive at our own conclusions, to reflect, to wonder. That is an act of trust. Trust that future humans would be capable of curiosity, of patience, of respect. And here we are. It is also worth noticing what these sites do not emphasize. They do not glorify individuals. No names carved in stone. No portraits of rulers dominating the landscape. The focus is collective. Shared spaces. Shared effort. Shared experience. This suggests a social value we often overlook. That meaning does not always come from hierarchy. Sometimes it comes from cooperation, from shared attention, from working together on something that no one person owns. That idea feels radical today, but it may be ancient. As this journey ends, it is tempting to want closure, a single explanation, a final theory. But the stones resist that. They do not resolve into certainty. They remain open. And perhaps that is intentional. Perhaps the builders understood that answers change, but questions endure. What matters, then, is not whether we can fully reconstruct the past, but whether we can allow it to change how we see the present. We can choose to dismiss these sites as anomalies, or we can let them expand our sense of what is possible. We can insist that progress only moves forward, or we can accept that it sometimes loops, stalls, or retreats. We can assume that our way of building is the only way, or we can acknowledge that other ways once existed and might exist again. In the end, the stones do not ask us to abandon modern life. They ask us to remember something we are at risk of forgetting: that knowledge is not guaranteed to survive, that understanding requires care, that what we choose to preserve says a great deal about who we are. If ancient people could speak to us now, they might not explain their methods. They might not reveal their secrets. They might simply point to what remains. And wait. The rest is up to us. If you've stayed with this story from the beginning, thank you. Not for agreeing, but for listening, for staying curious, for allowing uncertainty to exist without rushing to fill it. Because curiosity is the one thing that connects us to those who came before. Across stone, across time. And as long as that curiosity survives, the story is not finished.